It's pretty hard to believe that only 5 years ago, Wales was Six Nations Grand Slam winners, and even more incredible is the fact that they were the champions just 3 years ago. After a last place finish in this year's competition, for the first time in 21 years, we really have to ask ourselves the question, what's happened to the Wales Rugby National Team? As I've just said before, it feels like only yesterday when Wales dominated the Northern Hemisphere, with players like Alun Jones and Lee Halfpenny. They were a genuine force to be reckoned with. But seriously, what's gone wrong? How have one of international rugby's most historically successful sides fallen this far? So today, join me as we look into the downfall of the Wales Rugby National Team. As always, before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. Once again, thank you so much for the recent support on the videos. Honestly, without you guys, none of this would be possible. And so without further ado, let's go. What makes this drop off so unbelievable is the fact that Wales have one of the richest and most successful histories in world rugby. Playing their first international match in 1881, it wasn't until 1893 that they won their first Home Nations Championship, now Six Nations, also winning the Triple Crown in the process. In 1910, Wales won the inaugural Five Nations Championship, and subsequently a year later, in 1911, became the first side to win the Five Nations Grand Slam, basically meaning they won all their matches. Post World War I, the 1920s saw a decline in Welsh rugby due to an industrial recession in the nation, but by the 1930s, there was a complete turnaround as in 1931, Wales won their first Five Nations Championship in 9 years, and in 1935, Wales would beat the All Blacks 13-12 in Cardiff. After World War II, Wales won their first Five Nations Grand Slam since 1911. Yes, 39 years. And to top that off, they were going to win another Grand Slam, just 2 years later in 1952. By 1956, they'd won a third Five Nations Championship within the same decade. The 70s saw a second golden age in Welsh rugby, with world-class players such as Gareth Edwards, JPR Williams, Gerald Davies, Barry John and Mervyn Davies in their side. In fact, within that decade, Wales only lost 7 times. Incredibly, Wales won the Five Nations a whopping 8 times during that period, with their wins coming in 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973, 1975, 1976, 1978 and 1979. Simply remarkable. This would prove to be a transitional period for Welsh rugby, as some of their best players in Phil Bennett and Gareth Edwards would retire from rugby after the 1978 Five Nations. Unlike the 70s, Wales would only finish with a single Five Nations Championship, that being in 1988, off the back of a third place finish in the inaugural Rugby World Cup. The 90s would be slightly better, as Wales won the 1994 Five Nations Championship on points difference, but still lacked that consistency they had in the 70s, as they lost all 5 matches in the 1995 Five Nations. Consistently poor results led to a frequent change of coaches, which only meant more instability for Wales. From Kevin Bowring to Graham Henry to Steve Hansen, Wales continued to underperform, but little did they know that hope was around the corner. Under new coach Mike Ruddock, Wales won their first Grand Slam since 1978, and their first Six Nations Grand Slam in 2005. But later that year, reality hit when they suffered a record 41-3 home loss to New Zealand. To make matters even worse, controversially, Ruddock resigned as head coach midway through the 2006 Six Nations, where Wales finished 5th. As a result, he was replaced by Gareth Jenkins. Jenkins led Wales through the 2007 World Cup, where they failed to make out of the group stage, which led to his sacking, and he was replaced by New Zealander Warren Gatland. Having stints with Ireland and Premiership club side Wasps, who I made a video on into their entire history, which you should definitely go watch after this, not many knew what to expect from Warren Gatland, but in his first year he shocked the rugby world, and in his opening game alone, Wales would beat 2007 Rugby World Cup finalists England at Twickenham for the first time in 20 years, but he would top that, as Wales eventually won all their matches to claim the Grand Slam. At the 2011 Rugby World Cup, Wales reached the semi-finals for the first time since 1987, but crashed out, losing by a single point 9-8 to France. The two sides would meet again a few months later in the 2012 Six Nations, with Wales needing to beat the French to win the Grand Slam, which they did with a 16-9 victory. A year later, Wales were going to retain the championship for the first time since 1979, and 2 years later, in 2015, made it to the quarterfinals of the Rugby World Cup. The best was yet to come in Gatland's tenure, as Wales also achieved a 4th Grand Slam in 14 years, and their first in 7 years in the 2019 Six Nations. This Grand Slam would be truly special, as Wales reached the top spot in the men's World Rugby rankings in August of 2019. And in the 2019 Rugby World Cup, they were going beaten in their pool, but were knocked out in the semi-final by eventual winners South Africa. This would mark the end of the Gatland era, for now. In July 2018, Warren Gatland agreed to step down after the conclusion of the 2019 Rugby World Cup. He was replaced by Pivac, who had big shoes to fill. Pivac's tenure wouldn't start great, as in the whole of 2020, Wales would manage only 3 wins, finishing 5th in both the Six Nations and Autumn Nations Cup. This was horrific, considering the fact that over just a year ago, they were the best side in the world. In 2021, they would bounce back, winning the Six Nations, but a year later, it was the same story. Wales slumped to a 5th place finish in the 2022 Six Nations Championship, with their sole win coming at home against Scotland, and embarrassingly, in the final match day, they would endure their first ever home loss to Italy, 22-21.
The Italians are heroes all! 36 Six Nations defeats in a row has been ended with their first ever away victory at the Principality Stadium.
But somehow, the worst was yet to come, as later that year in the 2022 Autumn Internationals, Wales went from beating a strong Argentina side a week prior to losing to Georgia at home. Yes, you heard me correctly, Wales Rugby National Team lost to Georgia at home. Now that in itself is a sackable offence, and the Welsh Rugby Union seemed to agree with me, as not too long after that humiliating loss, Pivac was sacked, but his predecessor surprised everyone. Remember when I said earlier that Gatland's tenure was over for now? Well yeah, the Welsh Rugby Union decided to reappoint him as head coach. At first, things weren't looking good, as once again Wales would finish 5th in the Six Nations, but in the World Cup later that year, it seems as though they'd turned things around, as they went unbeaten in their pool, but were knocked out by Argentina in the quarterfinals. It wasn't necessarily Wales' best performance at a World Cup, but after this year's Six Nations, they would have been wishing they had this form then. So from this, you probably have an idea of how Wales' 2024 Six Nations campaign went. Awfully. They lost every game, finishing bottom, and thus receiving their first wooden spoon in 21 years. But in a strange turn of events, in his post-match defeat interview, Warren Gatland revealed he offered his resignation to the Welsh Rugby Union Chief Executive, Abby Tierney. But what makes the situation even wilder is her response, where she said, "Like hell, that's the last thing I want, that's what I'm really afraid of." I mean, all I'm going to say to that is that sticking with a coach who's offered to leave, regardless of his experience, is pretty bold. But honestly, who knows what the future holds for Welsh Rugby. From tournament winners just 3 years ago, to now wooden spoon holders, it's hard to say what's next for Wales. For a national side with such a rich history, it's a shame they've even got to this point. But the Welsh Rugby Union need to change things now and start rebuilding for the future before things somehow get any worse. But where do you think the future of Welsh Rugby is heading? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. As always, make sure to like, share and subscribe for more of the best rugby content. Also, thanks for the support on the recent videos. With that all said and done, it's been your boy John Talks Rugby, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click on screen now to watch my recent videos.